welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the recent Mardy Fish documentary that was released on Netflix just a couple of months ago. And a lot of people have been reaching out to me and bringing it up to me. And I think, Brian, you've had the same experience because of many of the themes of the documentary. I think we can give a little bit. I think it would be helpful to give a little bit of a background about what the documentary includes, because I'm sure some of our listeners have seen it, but maybe some haven't. So I would say a couple of the big themes are, just a brief synopsis of the documentary was it included a lot of Mardy Fish's struggles on the ATP Tour once he really reached his highest heights. So he essentially he was ranked a lot lower, outside of the top 10 for many, many years, really changed his lifestyle in certain ways in order to get to the top 10. Was at really the pinnacle of his career, and then unfortunately had to stop playing for an extended period of time, for right around 3 years, due to some mental health issues that he was going through at the time, relating to anxiety. So that's sort of a very brief summary of things. But in today's discussion, Brian and I will talk about certain themes that we found from the documentary. But I think we were talking about this off air a little bit. It's important that we're not in no way are we casting judgment here. On Mardy Fish, on anyone else from the documentary. I mean, professional athletes certainly go through an enormous amount of stressors in their life, and have a lot of pressure on them. A lot of the media and the fans are constantly watching on a day-to-day basis. So we also can't really imagine what they're going through and can't put ourselves in their shoes. So when an athlete, whether it's Mardy Fish, whether it's Simone Biles or Naomi Osaka or Michael Phelps or any of the other professional athletes at the highest level who have in recent years opened up about mental health issues, this often leads to a lot of people speculating and casting judgment. And in this conversation, we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be, discussing the documentary, but more so discussing the themes that were brought up in the documentary and some of our thoughts on some of these themes, rather than casting judgment on Mardy Fish or any individual, because ultimately it took a ton of bravery for him to really open up about these issues and the struggle that he has had, and really overcome in many ways. So just wanted to make that clear. And Brian, do you have any other thoughts on that before we really dive into the conversation?
Yeah, I'd say that from a level of competency, you and I, Josh, are more on the performance enhancement side, right? And so this documentary is much more about mental health and dealing with anxiety and so forth. And for you and me, that's not the work that we do. So if people if they watch this and they may be feeling the same way, or they have other types of mental health issues, you really want to reach out to somebody who is an expert in counseling psychology, or a psychiatrist, or other types of clinical psychology, to get help with that. So certainly Josh and I are not looking at this as any way of sort of like wanting to get business for that type of work. That's not what we do. And yeah, we're really more about performance enhancement. But I think from it's an interesting documentary. It's about tennis. It's about, mental side of the game, mental issues in the game. I think the name of the documentary is very interesting, Breaking Point. We talk about break points oftentimes in tennis, and breaking point is another thing. We might even be looking to exploit the breaking point of our opponent when we're playing. And so there's sort of a lot of different, a little bit of wordplay there just in the name of the documentary itself. But I think, we're really just looking at this as almost like a review of the documentary, interesting themes. that we picked up on, and just go from there. And I do think it was really quite well done. I saw some interviews with Marty outside of this that he had connected with the directors and the writers of the documentary who've done several other ones that are well known, and he really connected well with them. And he talked about how discussing this chapter in his life actually helps him to feel better, and how part of this project was a way of helping other people deal with potential mental health issues that they have. And so I think it was really great that Marty was able to share these things and his story with the world in such a way, in such an open and honest and vulnerable way, that perhaps back in 2011 just wasn't possible. So it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has happened in the last decade, as it relates to mental health and as it relates to athletes opening up about some of the challenges that they've overcome. So I think that the timing was right for him to really open up about it. And as you said, he feels a lot better when he is able to open up about it and when he's able to help people. And I really liked the end of the documentary where they talk about how he became, I think right around 2 years ago, he became the Davis Cup captain for the U.S. Davis Cup team, and that allows him to pass on his experience and his wisdom, but also I'm sure helps with whatever players on the team, whatever any of them are overcoming in that moment, and he can express what he's been through and hopefully help others on a first-hand basis on the team, but also help a lot of athletes through this documentary as well. I mean, when I was at the Tennis Hall of Fame, a lot of people would come up to me asking me about it, if I've seen it. So I think he is certainly making an impact through opening up about these sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe we start to get into this a little bit. As it opens up, it talks about Marty in his early career, even as a junior, going to Saddlebrook, and that's where he met Andy Roddick. And at a later point in time, Andy moves home, and Marty moves in with him. And I think that's where you start to see, and Marty discusses this, that the real difference between Andy and Marty. Andy is someone who almost needs to win, and the family is, it's a high achieving family. And there's a scene in there where Marty talks about Andy's dad waking him up at 5 a.m. and saying, Marty, get up, it's time to stretch. And Marty's like, I'm so tired, I need to go to bed. No, it's time to stretch. And so, he kind of stepped into this environment that perhaps he had no idea what he was getting into, right? And he became more or less Andy's practice partner and teammate in high school, and so forth. And to me, that was like one of the first themes that comes up, is the level of discipline and really obsession one needs to become the best tennis player in the world, which Andy Roddick did become for, even though it was a short period of time that he was there. I mean, he was there right before Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal and Djokovic, right? I know there's always this talk about what's going on with men's American tennis. And as Roddick, rightly said, well, here's what the problem was, is like these three guys, really ended up being the problem. And certainly Federer was first. But yeah, so I thought it was very interesting to see that contrast between who Andy was, even as a young teenager, into his early 20s, with who Mardy Fish was at that time. It wasn't at that level of really obsession or, the willingness to do whatever it took to win.
Yeah, it did seem that once he moved in with them, his lifestyle certainly changed through training at Saddlebrook as well. Being around in an environment that had trained people like Jim Courier and Pete Sampras and many others. Just between the two of those things, being in a totally new environment, it certainly increased the level of intensity, and I'm sure helped his development in certain ways. But yeah, it was. It also led I'm sure to certain you know a constant comparison between him and his roommate who was across the hall from him in the same house. And they talked about how Andy Roddick was featured on Sports Center growing up, and I always had a lot of eyes on him at Saddlebrook, and um, he was almost outshadowed by Andy in certain ways, and almost brought in certain ways maybe to be that practice partner and to help Andy, to give Andy that support. So that I thought when they were talking about his development, that was an interesting piece of things. How much his life radically shifted when moving in with the Roddicks.
Yeah, it almost seemed to a certain extent that Marty was kind of comfortable with the arrangement in a way. He was certainly getting better, um, just being Andy's practice partner, and he had a level of success certainly in those early 2000s into later 2000s. Um, so yeah, it was hard to know um, what Marty's perception of the arrangement was. Certainly, he improved through that process and so forth. But I did think it was interesting that one of the transitions for Marty was something that Roddick talked about, how top players are willing to do whatever it takes to win. If they have to stomp on somebody's head, they stomp on somebody's head. If they have to be obsessive about training, nutrition, strength, and conditioning, that's what they do. And he mentioned that Andy said that I can look at somebody when they're 18 years old and I know if they've got it or not. And Marty didn't have it. But he also said Marty's the only guy I've ever seen to get it later. And there was a transition for Marty where he started to really emphasize his strength and conditioning and his practicing, and he became more obsessive about that, became more disciplined with his whole um, training and practicing. And I think it's in that process that he started to become different. He started to become closer to what a top player needed to do, but perhaps it was not also really him at a certain level.
Yeah, I mean they show in the documentary how I think he started at 202 pounds, and said, I'd love to maybe we could lose 12 pounds here, and then I think after about 2.5 months he was down 31 pounds, just almost to an obsessive level of the strength and conditioning and also training on the court, but also having a pretty restrictive diet in a lot of ways. They talked about cutting out the pizza and the beer and different things that he was eating. So he certainly was making sacrifices and going closer to that level of intensity and commitment that maybe he had started to see a piece of living with the Roddicks, waking up at 5 in the morning. But really from the point, I mean, he was already a professional player, top professional player in certain ways when that had happened. But he made the determination that in order to get to the top level, and he actually set his goals on the year-end championships in London, which is only for the top 8 players in the world. But he made the determination that in order to get to that level, he'd have to really, increase his training, really get that into gear in terms of the strength and conditioning, in terms of the diet, in terms of his on-court performance as well. And yeah, it does seem that changed him. That changed, something about him and really what made him him, and his way of operating in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think a theme that you probably talk about, Josh, with your clients, and I do as well, is professionalism. Trying to help people achieve levels of professionalism, and of course there are more and more and more levels to that. Um, but is there a danger? Just in this is sort of a general comment. in getting to extremes of anything. And perhaps that's what we have here a little bit is extremes. But I think it, like something like professionalism is a good concept. But hey, couldn't it be taken too far? Maybe. Um, Same with obsession. I think obsession is something that we often give a negative connotation, although to be obsessive about positive things can be very beneficial. Most of the people who are deemed successful, I think, in our societies are often obsessive about what they do. We may not use that word. We might say they're passionate about it or use other words that don't sound so negative. But in reality, I think obsession with positive things can be good, but perhaps that can go too far as well. And maybe that's some pieces of what happened here. Obviously, we don't really know. We don't know the situation. We only know what is in the documentary itself. But I thought that that was a potential theme of what was going on, was that uh, almost that excessive level of, like, if we put things on a continuum, of like not professional to 100% professional, are we almost like going beyond that? Um, and and then that maybe leads to some sort of inauthentic behavior for Marty, and maybe he's not quite the same guy that he used to be.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, at a certain point, his yes, he was making a lot of strides in his fitness and his game and his ranking, but it seemed to change him, maybe in certain negative ways that maybe led to what ended up happening down the road, months down the road. Where I think if I making sure to have this timeline right, it was 20. It was, I think, the off season leading into the 2011 season when he really went through this transformation with his body. In 2011 is when his ranking went from outside the top 100 to 7 in the world. And then it was that following year at the U.S. Open in 2012 um, when his anxiety struggles really came to a head at the U.S. Open, leading up to a match against Roger Federer.
Right, right. Um, I think the other, so I was asked this weekend, just like you said, people coming up to you and so forth. So I was at a college match this weekend, and somebody came up to me and asked me what I thought of the documentary. What did I get out of it? And for me, and I've thought this ever since I watched it, was, for me, the dominant theme was this idea of what toughness really is. And what made me think about that is that, and people may not be aware of this, but they kept layering in these clips of Jim Lair talking, and those clips are from a DVD, or you can actually see the video on YouTube. The 16-second cure. It's really about helping players design a between point routine, and the clips were chosen, I think, to make it seem like mental toughness is this very binary thing, right? You have to be 100% positive. There's no whining, no complaining, almost like impervious to any negativity. 100% positive, right? So it seemed like they were trying to set up this definition of what it meant to be mentally tough, and then how compare that, I would say, to what Marty became, right? And Marty probably was embodying a lot of that, maybe taking it in so much, right, of being this guy who was tough out there and wouldn't let anything get in his way. Now, I think also what's not maybe in those 16-second cure clips, but anybody who's grown up in the United States, I would say 1990s and prior, probably has a certain definition of what it means to be tough as a male, especially a male player, right? And I'll speak for myself here. That for me growing up, toughness was about not showing any weakness. You never cried about anything. Um, you never were vulnerable about your true feelings with things. You always had a very brave outward appearance, right? Nothing was getting to you. And that's just how we were raised, in the 70s and 80s. And so with that though, the emotion that we were allowed to show was anger. Anger could actually be seen as an emotion that displayed how tough we were, and we could show that. And we, men typically weren't questioned the same way around that type of outburst as, say, women would have been or are questioned about that, right? It's a totally double standard there. So we, so and I think I grew up with that sort of definition of toughness, and probably has, you know, held me back on certain things, and I've gotten through that over the years, and figured out that that's not really what toughness is about. And I think that that's where Marty ended up, is that, and he talks about it, I believe, in the documentary, but certainly in other interviews, that toughness is about being vulnerable. It's about telling your story. It's about admitting you're uncomfortable in a certain situation. And as you said earlier, Josh, the whole thing is just a testament to his bravery and his courage. That's, to me, that's real toughness. Having the courage to tell it like it is, and to admit how you're feeling, and then to deal with it, and then move on. I think, for the other definition of toughness, we would try to just push things aside, sweep them under the rug, and you don't really end up dealing with anything there. And then that's really where a lot of the problems can come from, is because you've never really resolved what it is you're feeling like. And so that's really what I got out of the documentary, was that this sort of, again, I'm speaking for myself because I felt like I was given this definition of toughness or lived it, that in itself was problematic. And that sometimes you can take that definition of what it means to be tough too far. And so when they were layering in those clips of Jim Lair and Marty talking, and it's like, oh wow, I think what the filmmakers are trying to say is that this whole concept sometimes of mental toughness, making it about like this impervious fortress of strength, and you have to be this way, you have to be tough, ended up being a part of the problem. I wonder if you saw that same thing.
Definitely, definitely. I think they talked about how the USTA built. I think it was the late '80s. They started building these regional, national training centers around the country, and how mental toughness and really mental fortitude would be a big part of that goal of building of that next American champion. Realizing maybe that would put a lot of pressure on their athletes, but also wanting to reach the heights of the quote unquote golden era of American tennis, right? That includes the players from the 70s, 80s, 90s, where the U.S. The 80s, yeah, the U.S. had many of the top players in the world, and were winning many of the Grand Slams. So I think that was part of the plan, to really have that focus on mental toughness and on the mental aspect of the sport. But can it go too far and almost be corrupted by this feeling that you're not allowed to show any weakness, and you're not allowed to be vulnerable. And as you said, the gender component, I think, especially for men, that the fact that men are only really allowed to show anger, that it causes, a suppression of emotions that ultimately is very, very unhealthy. So no, I definitely took that away. And I think, fortunately that's changing. And I think, when I grew up in the 90s, that had maybe started to change a little bit, but I would say I've seen that change more over the last maybe 5 to 10 years since I've been coaching, since, I've been doing this work in sports psychology, that now there is that willingness for athletes to open up. There's that, now teenagers will regularly talk about things like, oh, I'm feeling anxious right now. Where I would say in the past, even when I was growing up, that certainly wasn't the case. People didn't use words like that in their vocabulary, among friends or in training settings. So things are certainly heading in the right direction there. Is there a ways to go? Yes, but I would say that both societal and sport understanding of what toughness is and what resilience is has shifted in a positive direction, where it's not just about being able to withstand anything. Now it's okay, we want to you know not just be resilient, I guess, and withstand whatever challenges are thrown our way, but also keep wellness in mind,
Yeah.
and well-being, and not just okay, I can not show any negative emotion here, but I'm also looking out for my well-being and my health overall.
And I think it's a lot about recognizing all those emotions and, the willingness to be human, the willingness to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to learn. And as you said, if we're suppressing some of that, um, then that could, potentially lead to issues going on, later on. I do agree. It feels like things are getting better in that regard. I notice too that parents seem to have better relationships with their kids, or different relationships with their kids. I think there's a lot of good conversations that go on between parents and their kids that make them feel like they can talk about these things, which I think is great. I think coaches have also, for the most part, updated how they interact with players, and understand what they're going through. Many of the coaches now in tennis have gone through the system and understand how difficult it is to go through that. And I think I've said this many times on this podcast. It's probably harder now than it's ever been, especially if not just American players, but speaking from an American perspective, where most American players want to play college tennis, and there's this such obsession by college coaches on UTR that it creates a whole system of anxiety around that may not exist in some other countries that don't have college sports, that don't have you being recruited um, based on an algorithm, or ranking points or whatever. So I think there's a lot of that here, at least. Um, so yeah, things are getting better, and I think it would have been interesting, like if a player like Fish's stature had this situation today, what would have been, say, the actual message that went out to the public? Because at the time, it was all about some sort of physical issue or maybe a heart issue. It was not immediately um, associated with anxiety or mental health, and maybe I think you said this off air, Josh. Maybe they didn't even know at the time, perhaps, right? But although he refers in the documentary of just having all of these thoughts going through his head, so he clearly knew something was going on, but he just couldn't stop those thoughts, and that was then having a physiological reaction with his heart and his heart racing, and just there was no way he could play. But I thought it was also a brave decision, Josh, for him to, and I think he was helped by his support team, and which is a really important part of any tennis player's life, is that we all have good support teams, but I think it was with the help of his wife and his support team that you don't have to play. But imagine pulling out of the U.S. Open in potentially one of the greatest opportunities of your career. But he did that. I thought that took some courage and bravery to do that, knowing look at over the last few years or last maybe year or so with Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles and how much criticism was leveled at them for being honest about why they were pulling out. Not that Mardy wasn't being honest, but whether they knew or not, it was never talked about at the time as being a mental health thing, right? And so I think the reaction was far more sympathetic then than certainly what Naomi and Simone received when they were being honest. Perhaps there may have been a gender component to that as well. I don't know. I don't think you or I were people who were criticizing those two athletes. If anything, we were empathizing with them. And also, when we think about athletes at that level, it's very difficult for us to even come close to identifying with what they go through, to even how they got to where they are. Just the mentality that they have to do what they do is beyond 99% of us to understand. We don't know how they grew up. We really know almost nothing about these athletes, right? Except what we see on TV, and that's a very small snippet of who they are. But they're amazing people. And what they have accomplished is amazing. And so I think it's very difficult for us to make any sort of judgments about anything they want to do. Right? If you're telling me you don't feel like you can do it today, all right, I 100% believe you. Let's figure out what you want to do. So I think at a certain level, when we talk, we still have some issues when athletes talk about this because there's still a lot of judgment out there. And if Simone and Naomi had said something was physically wrong, I think the reaction would have been totally different.
I definitely agree there. I think one of the challenges with mental health is that compared to physical health is that it's unseen, right? People on the outside can't see what's going on. Or if an athlete pulls out for something physical that they're going through, the public is pretty understanding that that this is something that they need to do. They don't want to make the situation worse. Where if it's something related to their mental health, sometimes it's seen as something that they're electing to do or they're choosing to make this decision.
Or a sign of weakness at some
Or a sign
level.
of weakness. Absolutely, which athletes, as you said, are taught from a very young age not to show weakness in order to always be dominant and be superior to their opponents, almost showing it through their body language and through your actions. I think also actually with Simone Biles in particular, it was an interesting situation. This maybe wasn't talked enough about, that the actual safety risks that she could have been going through by deciding to step out there when she wasn't emotionally ready to do so, when her mental health wasn't right, doing gymnastics, especially at that level, and having and not being ready to do that from a mental health standpoint can actually have a lot of safety risks. So I don't think that was necessarily touched on enough. But to go back to what you were saying, Brian, relating to Mardy Fish, no, it was interesting seeing how his it sort of started with his thoughts racing, right? It started, they talked about the match against Andy Roddick at the Cincinnati Masters. I think it was like 2003 or something, where he had match point, and that's where the thoughts start racing. And I think a lot of athletes can relate to that, right? Where maybe it's you have match point, or maybe it's break point, or some big point in your match, and your thoughts start racing. And the way that he explained it was, we talked about how Marty had grown up with Andy, and they knew each other really well. They knew each other's games really well. So Mardy Fish had a stronger backhand, and he said, "Okay, well, you know." He knows that my backhand's better, so that means he'll serve to my forehand. But he knows that I know that my backhand's better, so maybe he'll serve to my backhand. And then it's almost these thought patterns that become very circular at a certain point, and those sorts of overthinking and that those racing thoughts that started in that kind of a way almost manifested itself into some of the physiological symptoms that he was experiencing with his heart racing and not being able to control that. That I think happened in the match right before when he was supposed to face Federer in the match where he ultimately dropped out. I think it was his third round match where that was happening and had been happening, in other situations. And it just shows the link between our thoughts and the way that we feel physically. And yeah, I mean, hopefully when these situations happen in the future, and it certainly can happen to a lot of people, and is happening to a lot of people, by being open about it, you can ultimately seek help and get the help that is needed a lot earlier. You don't wait years not knowing what's going on, but with the lessening stigma, hopefully athletes feel comfortable coming forward to a trained professional sooner so they can get the help that they need on the mental health side, and it doesn't manifest into a longer battle than it necessarily needs to be.
Yeah, right. I thought, let's just go back to that Cincinnati Master story. I thought that was just like such fascinating, not only dialogue that Marty was using about the whole thing, right? Because they know each other and guessing, but it also showed just like what a gamer Roddick was. So what he ended up doing on that first match point is he kicked it high, wide to Marty's backhand. He wasn't ready for it. And so
Yep.
then he got another opportunity, right? And so Marty's going through the same process. Is he going to do it again? What's he going to do? And whatever. And what does Roddick do? He does the exact same serve, and it works again. And it almost like that just broke him in that match, right? Because Roddick came back and won the match. And so in a way, like really impressive thinking from Roddick, and perhaps Marty overcomplicating the whole thing for himself, and maybe it's overthinking it to the point where he lost the opportunity to come through there. But that I thought was a really fascinating part of the film. Your point about getting help and whatever, I think that's great. We want to make sure that we all feel like we're acting in an authentic way. We're acting towards what we feel is important in terms of our core values and character as a person, and maybe even it's just building some of that self-awareness about who you are, who you want to be, and those types of things, and understanding that being vulnerable, admitting how you feel, admitting you're feeling uncomfortable are not signs of weakness. You're actually being strong and brave and courageous. And I think that's the first part of really learning to be more self-aware and more of your authentic self. Tennis, like if we bring this back to a tennis thing, tennis should be fun. It shouldn't be, even at the pro level. I mean, there ought to be some level of enjoyment, right? That you are excelling at something you really love to do. And I think when you look at the top guys today, the top three guys, maybe they're not exactly the top three, right? But we all know we're talking about the big three. They've been there so long that there has to be some passion and love for what they do, or else they would have quit years ago. Similar to like a Bjorn Borg who got out, by the age of 26. These guys have gone beyond that. So tennis really should be something you enjoy doing, and if it's not, then there probably needs to be some examination of some purpose around that, or thinking back to when tennis was fun for you. What was different when it was fun, as opposed to maybe how you're feeling now? Because if it's not fun now, then there's something going on. And I think one way to figure that out is go back to when it was fun. What was different back then? What could make it fun again? What do you need to refigure or reconfigure the purpose of tennis in your life and what it's helping you do? Most of us, certainly not you and me, Josh, we're not going to be number one in the world, and we're not pursuing that. Most of the people who listen to this are same thing, right? Tennis is probably more of a, while we may be very serious competitively, it's a different kind of project for us. And it should be enjoyable no matter what we do. And so I would just like to, stress to everybody to see if they can connect with that joy in some way. And if you're not feeling that joy, think back to a time when you were, and perhaps compare what's different now versus what was going on then.
I think that's definitely an important point. We've talked a lot on this podcast about enjoying that process, right? Knowing that the road to development as a tennis player, as and whatever your pursuit is, even in another sport or another domain, is challenging. It takes a lot of hard work. There's always the ups and downs. There's a lot of winning, a lot of losing. We've talked on this show about some of the specific challenges of tennis as well. So by enjoying that process, that allows you to withstand those ups and downs by noticing the small improvements, the 1% improvements, by looking for enjoyment along the way, that allows that process to continue. So I think you bring up a great point that whatever level you're at, even at the professional level, it's critical to enjoy that process and to really find out what you're passionate about with the sport. It's often one of the first things I talk about with somebody. Why did you start playing in the first place? What do you enjoy about it? Because it can be something that you look back to during those tough moments, when maybe you're thinking about quitting, maybe when you're wondering why you're doing this at all. It can be helpful to really have that at the front of your mind. Okay, this is why I play. This is not who I am as a person, but this is something that I do and something that I enjoy. And remembering that and remembering some of the key reasons why you play can really help you through some of those tough moments.
And Mardy Fish mentioned, I'm not sure if this is in the documentary or something that he wrote, but while tennis doesn't necessarily have a lot of dire physical consequences like boxing or MMA, it is a gladiator-like sport. We've talked often about this as a combat sport, and the mental toll that goes on in a tennis match might be even tougher than say some of the other fighting or combat sports, because of that perhaps lack of physical connection that we have with the opponent. And so there has to be some level of purpose or enjoyment and understanding of that. This is how it works. It takes a lot of courage and bravery to go through that process, to go through that struggle. We talked about that in a recent episode about enjoying that competitive process, enjoying the stress of competition. Easier said than done, of course. But if we can, go back and connect with that and understand that what you're doing takes a lot of courage and bravery, and can you enjoy that aspect of who you are and what you're doing out there? Yeah, it's a tough sport. It's I would say that Marty's story can probably, I hope, inspire a lot of other people. And he's talked about this in some interviews that he's had post release of the documentary, that people have come up to him and told him how important it was to hear his story. Um, and whether they got help or just went out and did something because of his story that was inspiring. And that was, I think, one of the major reasons why he did this was to help people, but it also continues to help him in this process. So I'm sure that there are many people who have been inspired by this. And for those who haven't seen it, absolutely go. It's totally worth watching. I think the documentary is very well done, even just from a storyline, filmmaking, etc. It's very, very good, as are some of the other ones in this series. So the same people who made that, the Way brothers, they also did some of the other documentaries in the Untold series. That's what they're sort of maybe Netflix's 30 for 30 kind of thing. So I've watched a couple of the other documentaries, and they're also really, really, really good. So Josh, any of the sort of last concluding thoughts on your part for this?
Not really. I think we pretty much touched on a lot here. I mean, I think yeah. I mean, I think it's important just to remember that we don't always see the whole picture when we look at somebody, right? You don't always know what they're going through. That might be a professional athlete. That might be a child, right? We don't always know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't always know what's going on in somebody's head. So I think that's just always an important reminder, especially when it relates to mental health or some of these topics that we talked about today. That a lot of people are struggling in different ways, and just to remember that when interacting with everybody, and especially as it relates to sport, that balance is often the key long term, and having some balance. And yes, in order to reach the top of the game, it requires a level of dedication and you might say obsession, but to not let your health and your well-being suffer in the meantime.
Yeah, and I think it as people who are watching others do these things, the key emotion we can use is empathy. Just empathize with what they do and what they go through, and I'd say we really don't know what's going on. Even though the people we work with are always sort of uncovering more and more layers to that, right? So, yeah, fascinating conversation. Again, recommend that everybody watch this. A really excellent documentary. So, thank you all for listening. For more information on today's episode, you can check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag TennisIQ. Additionally, please subscribe to the podcast or to the show on your podcast platform of choice, which includes YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check out our posts on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.